Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Pacifica Institute Talk Series. This time, we're with Professor Najeeba Syeed-Miller. She's the Associate Professor of Muslim and Interreligious Studies at Chicago Theological Seminary, has served as Executive Director of the Asian Pacific American Dispute Resolution Center and the Western Justice Foundation. Both organizations are mediation service and research associations that work in the area of immigrant community conflicts, environmental disputes, school-based violence, and interracial tensions. She's recognized as a leader in peacebuilding and twice received the Jon Anson Ford Award for reducing violence between ethnic groups, both in schools and in the area of gang violence, and was named Southern California Mediation Association's Peacemaker of the Year in 2007. Her published works have explored the development of mediation programs in community police relations, intersections of religious family law and U.S. courts, just peacemaking from an Islamic perspective, and interfaith relations. Her current book projects explore the role of Muhammad, peace be upon him, as a peacemaker and institutionalizing interfaith education. Najeeba recently co-edited the book Critical Reflections on Interreligious Studies, Experiments in Empathy. Today, we're going to talk about her book that she co-wrote with two other writers, Christian and Jewish. Welcome, Najeeba Syeed-Miller, to our program. You are muted, I suppose.
Yes. It's such a pleasure to be here. I know this, unfortunately these days we can't be in person. And I would have loved to, share this with the live audience, but I'm delighted to join you here today on YouTube. And so as we were just hearing from Attila, this book is actually a process of 3 years of bringing together Muslim, Christian, and Jewish scholars. We met over 3 years. We had retreats together, and all of the scholars are also members of their own community. So it wasn't a Jewish scholar who is writing about Islam, but it's a Jewish scholar writing about Judaism, a Muslim scholar writing about Islam. And it was a really incredible experience because one of the things we found was that not only should individuals or community members be together in dialogue, but as scholars, we also need to not just write about each other, but we need to interact with each other. So I edited the book. We have about 12 different articles, so I'd encourage you to download it. It's actually downloadable for free. You can, the Luz Foundation was able to make it available to the public. So if you go to Brill, the publisher, you're able to download the book. And so that's very exciting that it's available to the public. There are sort of 5 lessons as I worked on this book that I wanted to share with you that came through both the writing of the book as well as the process of bringing scholars together. So what is this thing called interreligious education? Interreligious education is the idea of bringing people together of different religious traditions, not just for dialogue, but to actually learn about each other's religious traditions. So this book is focused on theological education, and this is the development of religious leaders and the development of clergy of each tradition. So one of the things we found as these scholars came together and wrote was that one of the wonderful ways to think about interreligious education is, does it advance dignity? Does it advance the notion of dignity? And so I think when we first started doing interreligious dialogue about some people put it 100 years ago here in the United States, probably very actively in higher education for the last 30 years, there was this idea that we wanted to just understand one another. And something that I've been writing about in my second book is the notion of dignity. That instead of thinking about just learning about each other, how do we build experiences so that we respect the dignity of one another? And this is a principle that you find in every religious tradition. So if you think about in the Muslim tradition, karama, dignity is granted to every human being by God, as the Quran says. So dignity comes not because I'm just a Muslim or I am Christian. Every human being is granted this notion of dignity, karama. So within the Muslim tradition, it has a very strong basis. So one of the reasons we engage with one another is out of respect for that dignity. And other religious traditions also reflect this notion of dignity. So I think we used to think of interfaith or interreligious work just to be able to get to know one another. But one of the questions we want to ask is, what do we do when the dialogue moves into places that are difficult? What do we do when the dialogue moves into issues that are difficult? What do we do when we don't understand one another? Because we want to make sure that when we come into interreligious education, that we keep our own religious identity. It's not about giving up your religious identity. So I think this notion of dignity has been very helpful, and that interreligious education should build the dignity of one another. It should not undermine the dignity. So if you're doing interfaith encounter, interfaith with people of different religious traditions, how do we understand one another, not just when we have the same beliefs, not just when we have the same ideas, but what and how do we navigate difference? So I think that's a really important question in this day and age when there are so many challenges to working across not just religious differences, but cultural differences and many other forms of difference. Are we building dignity? Are we restoring dignity? Are we respecting the dignity of everyone at the table? And are we seeing education as a process that builds the dignity of everyone at the table? So that's sort of one thing we've learned, is that this should be a process based on dignity and dignifying one another, not just understanding one another. Because you could understand someone, but not actually, just because you learn about a different religious tradition. We used to think, well, you just learn about a different tradition. It doesn't mean that you will increase your respect for that tradition. You may actually learn about another religious tradition and use it in a negative way to undermine them. So I think this idea of dignity is really important. It's a central question. Another thing we learned, particularly one of the authors, you may be familiar with Reuven Firestone. He's one of the scholars that wrote for this book. And one of the things he challenges us to think about is that interreligious education and dialogue are not new. And he does a historical perspective. And I think it's really important that we think about, when we teach how different religious communities engage with one another, we only often talk about the wars between religious communities. We talk about the fighting, we talk about the battles, but we don't talk about the times of peace. And what we know is that actually between different religious traditions, there have been more times of peace than there have been times of active war. And I think this is another thing, is we need to look at the intersection between interreligious education, history, and peace education. So what were the factors during the time of Prophet Muhammad from the Compact of Medina that encouraged religious pluralism? What were the times in history when Muslims and Jews and Christians, or Muslims and Jews, or Muslims and Christians were living in peace? Because unfortunately, the way we teach history, so often we focus on those times of violence, forgetting that there have been many centuries and times of peace. And I think this is a really important inquiry, because what it tells us is interfaith encounter is not something that just came to the United States in the last 100 years. In fact, as we know, in the United States, the African American Muslim community was the first community to come here. So America has had an interfaith religious experience for the last, before it's even the founding of the United States. So it's asking those questions, not just when and how can we establish peace now, but when and how have we established peace in the past? So one of the things we learned in developing this book is that interreligious education is not just about contemporary interfaith engagement, it's also an historical lens, and asking the question, well, when were we able to cooperate? What were the factors that led to that? Another thing that's also important is we used to think that as time went on, and I was speaking about this with Mr. Attila earlier, we used to think that as time goes forward, things always get better. That this idea of time as progress, that as time moves on, things will improve. What we are finding is that in interfaith encounters, actually, for instance, hate crimes in the United States can spike. Interfaith encounters all over the globe, we have seen some of situations that were in the past much more positive deteriorate. So I think what this teaches us is that when we look at the fact that interfaith education is not new, and it is also something that has to be constant. You can't wait for the conflict to erupt. You have to do it consistently. And I think this is a really important tie. Timur Yuskayev in the book writes about this notion of how time plays into interreligious encounter. So it's looking in history, it's looking forward, but as we look forward, we have to understand that the interfaith encounter is a constant dynamic of conflict that needs to be addressed. Because if you pull back from addressing it, some of those ancient wounds or conflicts also will resurface. I've gone into conflicts all over the world where for some people, their memory of 500 years ago is as if it was today. They're not separated. Their sense of time is tied together. So I think we have to think about the notion of the past, engaging in lessons from the past of what to do and what not to do. But also going forward, we have to think about, for different religious traditions, how do we continue? And you have such great examples here in California and in Los Angeles, that interfaith relations are a constant form of activity. They can't just stop, or they can't just start when there's a crisis. Another thing we learned in this book project and this is that interfaith or interreligious encounter should take into account religion, but there are also many other factors. So for instance, the idea of language. When I use the word karama from the Arabic root, karama yakramu from the Quran, that form of dignity has a particular meaning. When a Jewish scholar uses a particular word of healing, tikkun olam, healing of the world, when a biblical scholar of the New Testament talks about hope, what we found is sometimes we would get together and we said, well, we all believe in hope. We all believe in justice. And one of the things is, I think it's important to point out, is that actually sometimes the language itself has a richness to it. So when I talk about justice from a Muslim perspective, I often use the example from Surah Rahman. The Surah Rahman, this idea of justice in the Muslim tradition is actually about balance. It's about the mizan and the balance established in the universe. And that's a different metaphor than maybe how a Christian may use the word justice. A Christian may have a different understanding of that word, a Jewish person. So I think that's really important, because sometimes we want to learn the nuance. We want to learn the specificity. What for a Muslim does the word justice mean to you? Because if we just throw around that term and say we all believe in justice, we all have hope, we all have patience. You know, this idea of sabr in the Quran, patience is and the Quran says that Muslims are to have sabran jamila, beautiful patience. That's a very unique, it's a very unique wording. And then one has to go into the Arabic meaning and understand it. So we found that interfaith dialogue is not just between different religions, it's between people of different languages. And let's add to that another layer. When you have Muslims at the table, not only are many of them, coming, Muslims or Christians or Jews, they're coming with their own ethnic identity, their own historic identity, their own cultural identity. So we have to understand that, in addition, one of the things, a really good chapter in this book is on African American religious pluralism. My colleague, Monica Coleman, and I taught a course at Claremont School of Theology when I was a professor there on African American Muslims and the history of African American Muslims. Because what we found, and as she writes in her article, which I would encourage you to read, is that the experience of the African American community in the United States and pre-United States, that there was an important element of being able to talk about race. And so it's not just an interreligious encounter. You have to be able to talk about race. You have to be able to talk about culture. You have to be able to talk about language. Some people have come from Muslim majority countries to the United States as immigrants. Some have come from Europe. Some have come, so even the way that we have experienced being a Muslim is influenced by our culture, our country, if we were raised in the United States. So sometimes, I tell people, you think you're in for just an interfaith dialogue, but it's an interracial dialogue. It's an interlingual, meaning language dialogue. It's an intercultural dialogue. So sometimes the conflicts between our communities are not even based on religion. Sometimes the conflicts are based on these other elements that we all come to the table with. All of us come with these many forms of identity, not just our religious identity. And I think that's something that's really important that we really learn from this book. Another really important thing that we found in this book is that in interfaith dialogue, Christine Hong, one of the authors, talks about the idea of migration, that people who have migrated from another country to the United States have a bicultural identity. So in her case study, she was talking about Korean Christians, that not only are they Christian, but they're bringing with them the experience of being a Korean immigrant to the United States. So I think that's another transition, because what happens when communities migrate is many of their historic ways of teaching their religion, passing it on to the next generation, those are interrupted. They don't exist in the same way. The family is broken down in a different way than it was historically. So I think those are really important questions as we think about interreligious education, is what are the ways that communities bring both their experiences of religion, but also their ethnic migration, the communities as they are defined by race, by city, by location, by history. All of those factor in, and I think that's been a really important lesson in putting this book together, is how rich interreligious education is. It's it's not just about religion. It is tied to so many other factors. Another thing we learned, the fourth point that I was going to make, is we learned that interreligious education is not just about teaching knowledge. It's about what we call spiritual formation. It's about teaching the spiritual experience of these religious traditions. So Jenny Peace, in her article in the book, talks about this as co-formation, that what happens, and I was in both cases at Claremont School of Theology and now at Chicago Theological Seminary. I'm the only Muslim professor on a Christian faculty. And what happens when you start having these scenarios, what you realize is it's not just about reading about Islam, it's not just about reading about Christianity, but it's forming students to have a spiritual appreciation. So if we think about in the history of most religious traditions, it's not surprising that within the Muslim tradition, very often, or in the Christian and the Jewish tradition, it's the mystics who have often been the ones that do interreligious engagement, right? Because they are engaging in a deeply spiritual experience. And so I just wanted to kind of talk about that. A lot of times we say interfaith encounter, and we talk about it as an exchange of knowledge, as a cognitive function related to the brain, that I will read this book about Christianity, you will read this book about Islam, we will get together and we will talk about the religion of Islam, the religion of Christianity. But what gets left out in that equation is, what does it mean to spiritually be a Muslim? What does it mean to spiritually be a Christian? And how, in that tie to the divine and the process of seeking the divine in our lives, how do we actually build a tolerance for one another? How do we build an acceptance and appreciation? And that's a different kind of dialogue. That's a different kind of conversation than just sitting down and having a cognitive knowledge exchange. That is a conversation where people who are believers in their traditions speak not just from their knowledge of text, but they speak from their knowledge and experience of the divine. And I think this is a very complicated kind of exchange to do at times. But one of the things we know that things like site visits, going to houses of worship of each community help a lot. So maybe one day when we can all go back to being in the real world together, I think it's a very transformational experience to witness the spiritual connection that a community has for others. And I think it also means that when we do interfaith dialogue, we need to think about what are the spiritual ethics, what are the practices of what are the spiritual practices of each tradition. Like, for instance, in the Muslim tradition, I often talk about this notion of contemplation of creation. And one of the things we learn from Surah Rahman again is if you contemplate all of creation, the very diversity of creation, the fact that the trees and plants, that they worship God, that we are asked to look at creatures like ants, like bees, and contemplate, you see a diversity. That spiritual practice of contemplation of nature gives you a sense of the diversity of creation. And that diversity really builds a capacity to understand that we have to appreciate the diversity of all human beings and all creation. So it's not just sitting down and looking at a book about a tradition, it's living that tradition out. And I think that has been really helpful for me, because we've had a couple of conferences now on contemplative practices of Buddhism, Islam, Judaism, other traditions. And that's a whole other knowledge base. You may bring in a whole other set of practitioners, of teachers who address the spiritual practices. And one of the things that's beautiful is we find within those spiritual practices, and the technical word for putting together some of these practices are liturgies. We find, for instance, in some of the Muslim or other traditions, references to prophets that are appreciated in the Jewish tradition and in the Christian tradition. So I think it's important to remember that interreligious education is also about interspiritual education. It is a spiritual exercise. If you make it merely cognitive, make it merely information with a PowerPoint and not experiential in terms of explaining the experience of being a Muslim, the experience of being a Jew, the experience of being a Christian, the experience of being a Hindu, I think we miss out a lot. And that's a different kind of expertise. And that really brings me to my last point. This book has some very good academic articles, but also there are a lot of articles in it that you can apply really in everyday life. And one of the things we found that's really important is this notion of the importance of text and context. So I've already talked about text earlier and the importance of spirituality, but we also have to take on the deeper context of the religion, of the culture of different religious traditions. So Munir Jiwa has a great article in this book, for instance, about addressing the use of art in Islamic interreligious education. How do we bring cultural production? How do we teach using art? And what he has found is very often using modalities like art allow for an open-mindedness that one doesn't always experience just when we engage with the text. And I think it's important to do both. So I want to make sure you understand that I think with the three religious traditions, at least Muslim, Christian, and Jewish tradition, the text is very central. So I always teach the text. You heard me refer to the text here, the Quran and Sunnah and Hadith. Those are all important. The Quran and the Hadith are very important texts. The Hebrew Bible is a very important text, and all of the other, as you know, the Jewish tradition has a very rich oral tradition as well. So the text is always important. I think what we found is in the early generations of interreligious education, we were spending so much time just on the text and not looking at ways in which religious interreligious encounter, interreligious engagement. So things like art, as I mentioned, the music of different traditions, the food, and I think that I think that many of you have been on the forefront of that. We have found that that has been really an important factor in building understanding. And that's also a way to get together and celebrate. We celebrate differences. The art will not all be the same. The literature will not all be the same, but I think we have to enrich interreligious and interfaith conversation so that the exchange is not just about religious doctrine, and that is a place that we encounter and engage with one another. In addition, we have to think of other ways to have these conversations. So I hope these 5 points were helpful. I tried to make it accessible for something you can do in your community. So as an example, in your children's school, doing art projects around Ramadan, around, I think things like that allow for you to be and share and learn about other religious traditions, particularly with young children. Or I think this idea of art and doing more work around sharing our traditions, our artistic traditions, will allow for the inclusion. We talked about peace education. It would allow for art education, which we know is so important.
Yeah.
And I think that's it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Najeeba, for the wonderful presentation and the work that you did for this book, The Interreligious Education, Experiments in Empathy. In the time that we live right now, there are many different points of view from every segment of the society. And there's this problem of polarization in our society as well as we approach the end of 2020. We have the COVID. There are many aspects, different aspects to this. And how do you approach to this? The first question comes on our YouTube live chat. So please feel free to, I'm speaking to the audience, please feel free to write your questions on the YouTube live chat. And we also made a link to your downloadable link of your book.
Oh, good. You found the link. Okay.
So we shared that there. The first question comes that I'm convinced, the questionnaire says, I'm convinced with the reasons that we need dialogue, but when it comes to practice, we need ideas, practical ideas. Can you please tell us a few good practices that you saw, experienced, or heard of?
Absolutely. So I think one of them is starting with a common problem that needs many solutions. So one thing that I've found with my students, I teach courses in managing interfaith organizations. I teach interreligious, interfaith justice movements. So my students, many of them actually implement these projects. They're graduate students, they're imams, they're rabbis, they're pastors. So some of the projects, they will identify a common problem. And unfortunately, as you said, we live in a time with so many problems. And so an example, a student just reached out to me around homelessness in Los Angeles. So he's a Christian student, and he actually found a Muslim family living without shelter in Los Angeles. And what he did is, instead of saying, this is a Muslim family, I'm not concerned about it, he has become motivated to say, how do I get Muslims, Christians, and Jews to work on the issues of homelessness in Los Angeles? So it's a common problem. So instead of getting together and saying, let's get together and resolve religious issues between us only, what are the common problems that you're facing in your community? So he was able to mobilize, or he's in the process of talking to people on this issue. Gun violence is another issue. I'm just giving you examples of where people have been able to build common solutions, because these are problems that affect everybody. These are problems that everyone is concerned about. Safety of your children in your schools. I mean, that's an issue of safety that all of us would be concerned about. People going hungry. And all of these have religious purposes to them. In the Muslim tradition, You're not supposed to sleep if your neighbor is hungry, or what you want for your brother or sister, you want for yourself. So instead of, I think sometimes we think that the problem is religion, but how do we ask the question where religion is the solution? So the problem, I think too often we think religion is the cause of violence. And how can we begin to restate it and say, what are the problems of the world, and how is religion an example, and how do we get people together of different religious traditions? So that's one example, is to use religion for problem solving, and not just your religion, but multiple religious traditions. I helped a lot with immigration issues in the last 3 or 4 years. And for instance, there was a young man dealing with a migration issue, and he wanted to meet with a congressman, and his congressman wouldn't meet with him. So we sent a rabbi, an imam, and a pastor, and they didn't do anything. It was not, you don't even have to have a protest. They just sat with him in front of the congressman's office, and the congressman looked through the camera and saw people of 3 religious traditions and many other people. And he said, wow, I better meet with this guy because look, he's coming. So when we show up together, so this young man was able to get the meeting that he needed for an immigration issue. So I'm just pointing out that it doesn't always even have to be, it's just the act of coming together. So how is cooperation between different religious traditions a part of the solution? Because I think we have been fed for too long the idea that religion is always the cause of violence and discord. So let's take that question and turn it around and say, what are our common problems, and how do different religious traditions address it? So that's one thing. The other is practical, is I always tell people it's less about what we say when we're together with each other. When Muslims, Christians, and Jews are in the same room, we're nice to each other, right? People, I call it, people are trying to be so nice. No, you're the best. No, you're the best. It's actually what we teach our children when we are not with each other. So what and how are your children getting educated about other religious traditions? I remember walking into the Sunday school. My mom walked into a Sunday school class that we had, and there was a description of other religious traditions up on the wall in the Muslim Sunday school. And she got very concerned, because what happens is if Muslim children are taught negative things about other religious traditions, and by here I don't mean that it's not about religious doctrines, but they're taught stereotypes, or they're taught images based in hate, and that goes for every other religious tradition. So when we encounter and engage with Christians and Jews and other religious traditions, what are they learning about Islam? What are they, how are we teaching our kids other religious traditions? So it's actually not always interreligious education when we're together. It's about how we talk about the other when they're not there. So I wanted us to encourage us to see, how are our children learning about other religious traditions? Do they get accurate information? And are we encouraging our partners who do work with us to use accurate sources for teaching whatever religious tradition we come from? The other thing that I mentioned is this is really relational. This is about spending time with one another, and it's you could go out in the world and say beautiful things about your religious tradition, whichever religious tradition you come from, but if you don't manifest it in your life, and you're not having, for instance, this idea of ta'arafu, the Quran says, get to know one another. So if we live in isolation, it's interesting. One of the things that has come out of many of the studies on Islamophobia is that if people know just one Muslim, and this is not just with Islamophobia, but if people know just one person, or they have some extended member of the family from that religious tradition, their bias will go down. And that's why I keep emphasizing it's not just about the book and the text. People, the average person learns from, they have a positive experience with someone from a different religious tradition. So I think thinking through, and this goes not, here we're talking about interreligious education of all traditions, not just Muslims teaching others, but Muslims also learning about other religious traditions. So how do you build connections where you share with one another in a human way before the crisis happens? So another practical thing is really don't wait till there's, I always tell people, build relationships in times of peace. Because if you're waiting till the synagogue on the corner of the street gets attacked, and the first day you go, you knock at the door, people are already afraid of outsiders, understandably. The same if a mosque or a church gets attacked. So I think those are some of the practical pieces is think about education at all levels. I teach at the graduate level, but what does education look like for children in our communities? What are we teaching about other religious traditions? Are we also trying to think about religion as a solution to common problems, and how do we do that together? How do we also build with one another in times of peace? And I think last of all, I think this is uncomfortable in the beginning. Like, this is not always easy, especially if you're not from a religiously diverse place that you grew up in. Maybe you grew up in a community that's very mono-religious. So we have to understand that people will come with fears. People will be scared. Some of us, whatever religious tradition we were taught from, we're told to stay away from people of other religious traditions. So we have to spend some time. And I always tell people, don't do interreligious education if you don't know about your own religious tradition. You have to know what Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Hinduism, what do they say about religious pluralism, religious diversity, so that when, for instance, if you do something and someone in the community looks at you and says, well, why are you talking to those people? You have to say, well, as a Muslim, as a Jew, as a Christian, this is why I do the work. Take another question.
Wonderful. You're so full of ideas in practice. That was very helpful.
We should take more questions. Yeah.
Yeah, but really, it was beautiful. And as you mentioned, there was a research a couple of years back in India that if there are more interfaith relations, vivid, lively interfaith relations, there's less likely that there will be a kind of a religious violence across the segments of the society. So, which is very, very true, I suppose. Like, the more interfaith relations, the better it is for the social cohesion of a community. Another question comes from a dear friend. This time it's the topics, very sensitive topics. How would Israeli annexation of Palestinian, largely Muslim and some Christian land relate to the notion of dignity in these religions?
So I can't answer for those religions, but I would encourage you. There are 3 authors in the book, particularly Nancy Crimer. She talks about doing interreligious education between Muslims and Jews in particular. And I think that it raises a good question of how do we deal with communities that are coming to the table that don't just have it's not around religious difference per se, but it's related to a particular issue. So it's not only, there are many other particular situations around the world that bring up issues of dignity that need to be addressed. So I would encourage you to look at some of those articles, because I think one of the things that it's helped to frame is, again, looking at historically history through a lens that is much longer than just this recent 50 years, to have conversations about what are the causes of conflict between these communities. So I think that one of the ways to think through the interreligious education piece is, how do you frame what you are trying to address? And, I think it's important. I, for instance, am always careful when I'm framing a conversation that, is this about, am I bringing people together to solve a problem? And I think one conversation does not address those issues in a very complex situation. So I think it's very important to be clear about what your goals are. And if your goals are going to be a political analysis, if your goals are going to be talking about indignities, then be very clear about that, because that will be a particular kind of conversation. If your goal is to do a scriptural conversation looking at 2 different religious scriptures and considering what the issues are and having a religious literacy conversation about that, that's different. I think one has to just be very clear and transparent about the goals of the educational project, or the goals of the encounter. And if you have goals that have particular outcomes that you want to achieve, then that's going to dictate who comes to the table. And I think it's what I worry about is sometimes people will say and have goals that are so far reaching for one conversation that it's impossible to address them. But I would really encourage you to look at some of those articles in the book, but also to continue to ask that question, because we want to make sure that encounters are not more harmful. So if there's an encounter that is dealing with a very serious issue and it's not and it's put together in a way that harms people, that is not advancing dignity in that scenario. So I think you have to be very careful in what you design, and be very clear about what your goals are, and be transparent about who you are. So in conflict resolution, we say one of the biggest powers is the power of convening, bringing people together. So who you are in bringing people together and what your goals are, I think that's really important to be very clear about, because if one is not clear about that, then it can end up being those conversations can end up actually being a negative experience and pushing people further into not engaging. So I think that's a question I want to point out here, and I'll kind of end here. I think we have to, I always talk about this in my classes, that there's a continuum. There's interreligious education, there's dialogue, and then there's advocacy. So I think those are not all the same thing. And if you're doing advocacy for a particular issue, then that's a different kind of engagement. And sometimes one particular issue may have all three happening at once. It may have the dialogue, it may have education, which is learning about the tradition, not just conversation, and it may have advocacy happening. So I think you have to be really clear about where you are on that spectrum of whatever type of convening you're doing. If it's a convening for advocacy, then that is important and helpful. And I think that's clear. Or if it's a conversation around religious literacy, but really it's, I just think it's really helpful to be clear about what the goals of any type of project are. And my students do projects in all of those areas on all kinds of issues. I think what happens is we just think interfaith means people get together, talk about an issue. It's actually much more nuanced, and I think there's some great examples. And I think this question applies in multiple scenarios and situations.
Thank you, Najeeba. As you stated, the goals have to be clear and also be transparent. Because when I started doing interfaith, the first event, it was an Abrahamic event, I suppose, in Pasadena. And one person came up to me and said, well, we talked, we introduced ourselves, and then several minutes passed and said, Attila, you have to be giving me a reason to talk to you. And if you can convert, I think that we can continue our conversation. Convert to a religion. Well, I said, thank you. I'm not here for that purpose. Your goal is something else. So the goal has to be clear and transparent, as you say.
And it has to be participatory. So this is the ethics related to actually all of the questions. I've chosen not to participate in some dialogues where I feel like it would be a conversation that doesn't further dignity. And I want to be careful that, as if I'm engaged in that dialogue, in my embodiment of who I am, does it advance a conversation on dignity? So it's actually for so many different scenarios and situations. And I think that's where your ethical compass has to come into play and say, you have to be aware of sometimes any good interaction, it can also be used in a negative way. So I don't, for instance, want to engage in conversations where my presence is used to demean others or demean some form of dignity. So that's a question I ask myself all the time. Or when I'm putting together a dialogue, I ask myself, who is at the table? Who is invisible? Or whenever I'm making a table, meaning I don't literally make tables, when I'm constituting a table, there are choices of people who are included and choices of people who are excluded. And I want to be as inclusive as possible, and also recognize if there's an impossibility to always be inclusive. So what am I transparently sharing with people, because I also have ended up in situations where I was invited for one purpose, and then the dialogue or the educational process went in a completely different direction. And I've had to, I'll just give an example really quickly. I was at an interreligious educational panel on war and violence. And the opening question gave 3 examples of religious violence. And all of them were in Muslim majority countries. So the whole panel was on religion and violence, but it only mentioned 3 Muslim majority countries, and actually none of which I'm from. So I actually, when I was there on the panel sitting there, and I had to say, I said, this is, if this conversation is about religious violence and you've only used examples that have Muslims engaged in some way, then that makes it seem as if religious violence equals Islam. And any religious tradition, Islam certainly, and Muslims have been responsible for religious violence and have other religious traditions. And it made for a very awkward conversation. But I felt like if my ethical approach was, I had to ask a question about the way the question was being framed. So I think it's really important, but I didn't feel like it was a gathering. If they wanted me to come and talk, that was a different conversation to talk about Muslims and violence than to talk about religion and violence and to relate it only to Muslims. And I myself am very careful. I try not to get into places where I'm in a defensive stance, where instead of saying, and I try not to put others in a defensive stance where I'm here to learn about a religious tradition, not to ask the question in a way that already assumes the outcome. So I would say that's another really important piece, is how you construct the dignity of who's at the table. And I felt in that scenario, I had to speak about it and say, look, these are the examples that you used. And is this the purpose of this conversation? And if it is, I don't think that that's, I don't think that that's the most, it's just not an effective way to address interreligious issues of violence. So I just wanted to point that out. I do think you need to consistently use your aql, use your mind, and have a question, ask that question if you feel like something is constructed. The best thing to do if you are creating some kind of a dialogic experience, and dialogue is different than education. Education is teaching and learning. Usually you are engaging with some text. Dialogue can be just conversation. It doesn't always have to be engaged in a teaching process where you have some form of learning and teaching happening or information download. So yeah, I do think that those related to all the questions, you have to think about what is the purpose of the engagement, because I've seen interfaith dialogue or education used in a way that took people into a more traumatic place than into a place that recognized their dignity. So I think that's a conversation for us to think about, and that doesn't relate actually just to religion, that relates to race, that relates to so many other factors.
Yeah. Which brings us to our last question. And last questioner asks, me and my friends are interfaith work for a few years. Even I know dialogue is not about trying to convert your dialogue partners, which we talked a little bit about. You talked a little bit about. Some of us still has this insight. Is this wrong?
I think that's a question that you have to ask from your own self. I think what's wrong or right, I'm not here to give any any fatwas. I think that's really important to understand. I think I think that this is a good conversation. I wrote a book chapter in another book about working with evangelical Christians. And they feel, for the evangelical Christians community sometimes, and I want to also say one thing that's important to know is that interreligious and interfaith engagement is not just for people who have a liberal religious tradition. There are people who are very conservative religiously that can also do this work across different religious traditions. So sometimes you have to design the dialogue differently in that scenario. But this is a conversation that evangelical Christians are having. So it's not just a conversation for Muslims. It's not just a conversation for one particular religious community. I think it's a question you have to ask yourself, is what is the purpose of engagement for you? And there are multiple reasons for engagement. Frankly, there are sometimes political reasons. We know after 9/11, interfaith dialogue went up by 3 times. It shot up. And guess which communities were interested in doing it? Non-Christian religious minorities, right? That is a motivation for some religious communities. They want to do interfaith dialogue partly out of self-preservation. I mean, out of fear and concern that they communicate with people of other religious traditions. So there are many reasons to do interreligious engagement, interfaith conversation. It's not just, the purpose of it is not just interfaith understanding. I was talking about, for instance, problem solving, activism, many other reasons. I think ultimately that's a question for you to address yourself. To me, that's a question that I think about is about transparency. So am I being transparent? If that's my intention, then I think then that's about transparency, because also, so I can speak here from a Muslim lens, there's no compulsion in religion. So it's not, if one doesn't, if you're engaging in a dialogic process, then how are you transparent about what your purpose is? And I really think the best way for people to learn about other religious traditions is to see us in our real world and real environment being who we are. And so I would just say, that's a question of transparency. That's a question for you to work through and think through, whether it's right or wrong. I would say you have to be careful contextually. So I've been in dialogues in the United States. The relationship between, for instance, I was working with some Jewish colleagues who had grandparents that were tried to be forcibly converted to Christianity. And the forcibility was serious. It wasn't just about, we're talking about grandparents of people who are in their 60s and 70s. So that experience is carried in the community. So to come in and do conversion, this is particularly in that Christian-Jewish relationship. And I think that's another thing to keep in mind is when you keep adding, you have Muslim, Christian, Jewish, Buddhist, as you expand, it's powerful. And at the same time, you have to pay attention to particular dynamics between different religious communities. The Christian Muslim communities have a particular history. And then I was really struck in my classrooms, I started having Christians from Muslim majority countries, students who were Coptic students, and that was a whole Pakistani Christian students. So that was a whole other conversation. What does it look like to be a minority what does it look like to be a Muslim, a non-Muslim minority in a Muslim majority? And I had to think through so many different ways of looking at these questions. I think ultimately it's about transparency. It's about being open about your intentions in the work. And I think if you do that work, I think it's also about what's most helpful. What is the goal of the dialogue again? And so that's one of the ways I would answer that question is, exposure to people of different religious traditions. Ultimately, one of the things that Hans Kung and others say is that, and the Dalai Lama has also said this, is that ultimately there will not be peace in the world until people of different religious traditions learn how to live in peace with one another. So I think I want to turn that on its head. I don't think it's that religion is the cause for violence. But I do think that if we don't figure out a method of engaging with dignity with one another, it's not just peace. I think it's peace. This has been the missing step in that conversation around peace, is how do we talk about this notion and embody dignity and exhibit the best of each of our religious traditions, whatever they may be.
Thank you very much, Dr. Najeeba Syeed-Miller, for this beautiful discussion and answers to the questions and presentation about your book. That was very beneficial. I hope we can do a part 2 of it. You're full of ideas and practice, which every community needs right now to do this year and next, in this time of pandemic, I suppose.
I just wanted to share with you, there have been a lot of interfaith efforts around the pandemic, particularly in something called mutual aid, which is helping one another. So I want to encourage you to look at that as well. People of different religious traditions have really been incredibly supportive of one another in every city across the United States. So sometimes out of crisis, the best comes in our practices.
Exactly. Is there a website for this that you're talking about?
No, I mean, I think if you just look at interreligious, I'm actually working on a project. We're writing articles on this particular issue of how the virus has encouraged interfaith, particularly interfaith charity, interfaith cooperation. We're finding that a lot of health practices, so many healthcare workers are Muslim in the United States. Many doctors, nurses, healthcare workers are Muslim, and so we're finding that there are interfaith, a lot of interfaith conversations around issues of healthcare as well. So I think if you there isn't a particular website yet, we're working on it. It'll actually be up, but there are some collations of dealing with interfaith cooperation and the virus.
I see. Well, we can talk more about this in a future episode. Thank you very much, Najeeba Syeed-Miller, for this beautiful talk. And looking forward to having you again in the future in this time of pandemic. To our audience, thank you for being with us at this Pacifica Institute talk series with Dr. Najeeba Syeed-Miller about our recent book, Critical Perspectives on Interreligious Education, Experiments on Empathy. Have a nice evening.